it's an understatement to say that so much in the markets is driven by COVID-19, but so much in everyday life is driven by COVID-19. For instance, what happened here in New York City, the largest public school system in the country, upset a great many parents when the mayor said he was going to close down once again in-school learning. But earlier today, Yahoo Finance's Alexis Christoforous spoke to the American Federation of Teachers president, Randi Weingarten, about plans to reopen schools here in New York City and whether she agrees with New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's new plan. Here's what she said.
I think what was missed out of yesterday's decision was that it's built on two pillars. One is that Governor Cuomo really controls the tackling of COVID throughout the state. And he, like Governor Newsom, has this kind of regional approach now that actually really works. So Governor Cuomo has these yellow, orange, and red zones so that you know regionally in a community where your positivity rate is, what's happening in terms of community spread, because no school is an island. So there's a 3% regional rate now as opposed to a city rate. And that's important because Staten Island right now is way high. The community I live in, which is Inwood, is way high, but most of the places around the city are not. So it's that issue about whether your community has exceeded 3%. And then the next piece is learning from what we've learned nationally, internationally, but particularly in terms of the New York City experience. Younger kids and kids who are at risk really need schools. Hybrid education really doesn't work. And so ultimately, because about a third of the elementary school parents opted for in person, there's a way of programming schools so that there can be 4 or 5 days a week in person for elementary and for special needs kids. And that's a really good idea.
Randi, do your union members feel comfortable returning to the classroom right now? Or is there anything that they need to see before they do feel comfortable?
Well, that's a big question, and that depends on where we are. So, for example, what we learned because of the work that the UFT did in New York City is that the suite of safeguards that were negotiated, from masks to physical distancing, to ventilation, to electrostatic cleaning and testing, really worked. That needs to be a non-negotiable everywhere. And so what you see is that you saw when community spread was low, very little spread in schools. That gives people confidence that that schools, particularly for elementary school kids, can reopen. But if you actually go to Chicago or to a Philadelphia, where the ventilation systems in schools are terrible, people would look at you and say, how can you open up without having good ventilation and without having the resources? We need to have the safety protocols and the resources, and then the New York City has become a proof point that it can work.
Randi, looking at some of the things that we learned from this process, there was a recent op-ed in the New York Times, that was in October, that Black parents prefer remote learning in some ways because they can keep an eye on their kids in case, there are racial hostilities. So, and also because of the COVID risk. So I'm wondering, how can we translate some of these learnings that we saw through virtual learning when we finally reopen schools?
So look, trust is really, 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 really important. And I was on a webinar earlier today when I said that about trust, and that I really blame Donald Trump for the failure of even trusting the science because of his out and out lies and denials. So if what we've seen is that the communities that have been most impacted by COVID have been Black and brown communities and indigenous communities. And, if you're a parent and you want to make sure that if you've had COVID in your family, if God forbid somebody has died, you're pretty skeptical about whether or not something can work. And so you have to have a proof point that it can work. And that's why the transparency around testing, and that's why these protocols are so important. But trust is earned, and we're going to need a new president who talks about the data in an honest way, and who tackles it in an honest way in order to create trust amongst parents whose families have been deeply affected by COVID. Having said that, we need to think about this as an iterative process, meaning let's make sure that we don't lose the summer. Let's have a voluntary summer school. Let's make sure we can wrap services around schools. There's about 8 different things that we need to do at the same time. It requires resources. It requires following the science. It requires leadership, and it requires tackling the COVID surge right now. And we're putting out that blueprint today in an op-ed. But I do think we will get parents and educators to come around if we follow the science with fidelity, and people still see, after this surge, low rates, particularly for elementary school kids and kids that need, or kids, special needs kids.
Randi, you mentioned the new president. Top Democrats see you as a candidate for Secretary of Education in President-elect Biden's administration. Is that something you would be interested in?
Look, first off, I'm interested in doing my job. I'm interested in reopening schools safely for kids, making sure that teachers don't have the tremendous heartburn and really, I mean, they've been working in a Herculean way, but in a it's not sustainable, and they are really, really, really at a breaking point. So I'm interested in doing the work I can do for children, for families, for communities, for creating a middle class, for expanding a middle class, and frankly, I'm honored to do it as the president of the AFT. If you're me, and who has worked your entire life to help families, help educators, and help lift up a middle class, obviously it's an honor to be mentioned, but it's not something that I ever sought. It's something that it's just an honor to be mentioned. So, we'll see what happens.